Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. This is the book that we're going to be commentating on in this series. And this book is written by one of the great minds of recent history, economist Dr. Thomas Sowell, PhD, Harvard University. Now, this book here is a great book because it forces you to look at things from a different perspective. And in many cases, from an unpopular perspective or a perspective that many people tend to avoid. Now, the material in this book is like a breath of fresh air for many people who are looking for a narrative which is more closely aligned with what the actual facts are regarding the production of wealth, the circumstances of poverty, and the politics that play a role in both of those. And so the material in this book is both thought-provoking and also liberating when it's properly applied. So let's go in here into chapter 1 when we get in here. And the first, some of the first concepts that we're introduced to when we go into this book are the ideas of inequality. And the common assumption is that inequality needs to be explained. And so people have the misconception that humans began in a state of equality and somehow afterwards had fallen into a state of inequality, which reasons need to be discovered so this condition of inequality can be explained. And so what Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying in here is, hold on, that's not the case. There's more to it. So let's find out a little bit more to this. Here we go.
There is nothing automatic about prosperity. Standards of living that we take for granted today have been achieved only within a very minute fraction of the history of the human race and are by no means the norm amongst most of the people in the world today. Standards of living far below what we would consider to be poverty have been the norm for untold thousands of years. It is not the origins of poverty which need to be explained, since the human species began in poverty. What requires explaining are the things that created and sustained higher standards of living.
So what's powerful about this excerpt right here is that it changes your line of questioning and it forces you to look into different directions to find answers. And so what Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying is we should not be looking to ask questions about how humans became poor, right? Because humans started out in a state of poverty and that has been the norm for thousands of years. But rather we should look in a different direction and ask questions about how did people rise above those levels of poverty to create wealth and the higher standards of living that certain parts of the world experience today. And so let's be reminded that these higher standards of living are recent developments. Modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years, and it has taken many thousands of years to accumulate enough knowledge in order to unlock the levels of comfort that certain people experience in the world today. So we have to keep that in mind. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell notes in here that in the early 1900s, only 10% of the population had flushable toilets, and only 3% of the population had electricity, right? And we're talking about just over 100 years ago. And so coming up to today's time, where you have in the United States of America, at least, the poorest areas in the country, just about everybody has electricity and everyone has flushable toilets. And people have a lot more commodities as well, refrigerators, cars, like these are common things for today, right? Even in the poorest areas. But many people take it for granted that this is something that is not shared worldwide, that there's many areas throughout the world that still do not have running water, still do not have flushable toilets, and for sure do not have electricity, right? And so the question is, why is that, right? Why is it that America is able to have these higher standards of living? What did America do in order to create this type of wealth and these standards of living for herself? Now, when pondering upon this question, one thing we can come to understand is that being the first doesn't mean that you're going to be the most prosperous. And for example, we can see that America is one of the last formed nations, and then it eventually became one of the most prosperous nations, or if not the most prosperous nation in the world. And then you also have examples of people who started much earlier than America and other prominent civilizations like the Greeks, who had math, they had literacy, they had philosophy, they had all these things during a time when the British would have been considered an impoverished people. And you also have nations like the Chinese, the East Indians. You also have the Egyptians. They all had civilizations thriving at a time when the British would have been looked at as what they would have called other people savages.
The Chinese were for centuries more advanced than any of the Europeans, including among their discoveries and inventions the compass, printing, paper, rudders, and the porcelain plates that the West called Chinaware, or simply China. Cast iron was produced in China 1,000 years before it was produced in Europe. A Chinese admiral made a voyage of discovery longer than Columbus' voyage, generations before Columbus' voyage, and in ships larger and more advanced than Columbus' ships.
So we can see that the Chinese were much more advanced than any of the European nations for many, many centuries in certain areas of development. And also were the East Indians, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians. They all had civilizations many, many centuries before the British did. But what happened is that eventually the roles reversed. And so when you get into the 1700s and the 1800s, you then now have Britain leading the world into the Industrial Revolution. And according to Dr. Thomas Sowell, Britain was responsible for 40% of the major inventions, right? Thus coming from this lowly people and making their way up to this worldwide recognized force. And so how did they do this, right? How do groups come from these low levels of status and these low levels of development and rise up to the top and create civilizations and create these great things, right? That's what we want to know. And so some of the earlier civilizations, the development of agriculture is what played a major role in their developing of civilization and prosperity. And so this is what Dr. Thomas Sowell says.
Agriculture, the most life-changing advance in the evolution of human societies, came to Europe from the Middle East in ancient times. Agriculture made cities possible, while hunter-gatherers required far too much land to provide themselves with food for them to settle permanently in such compact and densely populated communities. Moreover, for centuries, cities around the world produced a disproportionate share of all the advances in the arts, sciences, and technologies compared to the achievements of a similar number of people scattered in the hinterlands. Because Greeks were located nearer to the Middle East than the peoples of Northern Europe or Western Europe, agriculture spread to the Greeks earlier, and they could become urbanized earlier, by centuries, and advance in many ways far beyond those peoples elsewhere who had not yet received the many benefits made possible by urban living.
So being able to produce food repeatedly within a given boundary is one of the major ingredients that made it possible for the development of civilization. So when you have agriculture, what it does is it allows you to take large groups of people and settle them in these smaller areas. Now, how does the development of agriculture contribute to the development of civilization? Well, when you have people who are specializing in animal and crop development, what it does is it allows other people to move outside of that industry and develop other expertise and skills and knowledge in other areas. Whereas it's much more difficult to do that when you have people who are hunter-gatherers and they're out always roaming around, spending most of their mental and physical resources on the hunt for food and other basic necessities as well. And so these settled communities, which are made possible by specializing in agriculture and being able to produce food in a certain boundary, allows communities to settle, and it allows these groups of people to develop different types of ideas and then share them amongst each other. And then they can use those ideas and implement them to further advance the society that they're in. And so over time, what you eventually get is a condensed population in a settled area, which then becomes a society established by laws, customs, and it has a variety of occupations. But the important thing to remember is that this is only possible by the industry of agriculture. And so agriculture developed in the Levant region, which is where you have some of the earlier civilizations, such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, thriving. And so you have Greece, who are nearby neighbors. They're coming over there. They're seeing some of these civilizations and their practices, and they're taking some of these ideas, borrowing some of these ideas, such as agriculture, and then they're bringing them back to their land, right, to help them jumpstart their civilization. But one of the things that Dr. Thomas Sowell stresses heavily within this book is that just because you have civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Greeks, or anyone else situated in a particular geographic location, it does not mean that they're predestined to do the things that they did or the things that they do. And that in fact, the geographic location is just one out of many contributing factors that influence the success or failure of people and nations. And so what are these contributing factors? Well, economists call them human capital, intangible resources. We're talking about things like culture, skills, knowledge, wisdom, right? Beliefs, desires, these types of intangible things, right? And so when you have human capital present in the right proportion, and also linked with that, you have the proper geographic location, then you have the possibility of developing civilization in the way that they did in the past. And so you have the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians located in the proper geographic location, right? The land is fertile, very fitting for the development of agriculture, but they also needed the human capital. They also needed the knowledge and the skills in order to develop the agricultural practice. They needed the belief that they can actually do it. And on top of that, they needed the desire to actually want to do it, right? And so without any of these human capital ingredients present in the proper degree, it doesn't matter how fertile the ground was. It could have been fertile to the infinite degree. It would have been of no use. And so the point is that just because someone is located in a specific geographic location, it doesn't mean that they're going to do anything. Being in a geographic location just means that you're either open or limited to the possibilities that that geographic location provides. And so different geographic locations have different influences on different people. So for example, you have people who settle in the mountain areas. Often these people lag behind in technology, and also they are more impoverished than people who settle on the plains.
Mountains are just one geographic feature, and geography is just one influence on human development. But whether considering geography or culture, isolation is a recurring factor in poverty and backwardness around the world, whether that is physical isolation or cultural isolation.
Now, this is a very important part for us to understand. When people are physically isolated, what it doesn't allow them to do is to observe and to be influenced by the creativity and the innovation of other people. And so what we'll learn later on down in the series is how the isolation of the West Africans contributed immensely to them being vulnerable to the attacks of outside people. And so when we're dealing with cultural isolation, this can be contributed and tied to physical isolation, but not necessarily. You can have cultural isolation without having physical isolation. So for example, you may have groups that are in the presence of other groups who have cultural practices that allow them to succeed within a given society. And because these groups may be unreceptive to those cultural practices, they are culturally isolated, right? And these could have negative impacts for people who have cultural practices that don't allow them to advance within a certain society. And on the other hand, you can have cultural isolation that also does have physical isolation tied to it. And later on in the series, we'll go into the account of how the Chinese culturally isolated themselves, and in doing so, they paid a heavy price for it. A price in which resulted in what Dr. Thomas Sowell called a role reversal between the Chinese and the Europeans, where at one time the Chinese were much further ahead, but because they culturally isolated themselves, they fell behind and the Europeans moved ahead. Here we go. And so the culture in which people participate in largely influences their likelihood of failing or the likelihood of succeeding. So for example, you can have people living in the richest nation that has ever existed, but if you have cultural practices and a mindset that does not allow people to see or take advantages of the opportunities, then the likelihood of success is very slim. And on the other hand, culture and mindset could take nations like 18th century Scotland and 19th century Japan from being underdeveloped nations to nations of high achievements as described by Dr. Thomas Sowell. So we have geographic location, human capital, culture, politics. That's another thing that he describes in this book. I would also include genetics, which I believe to have some influence, and a whole host of other factors, which when they come together in the right proportion, provide the recipe on how wealth is produced by some and not by others. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell ends the chapter by reminding the readers that these in themselves do not determine whether people will produce wealth or not, but that these are just influences, right? And that these concepts are fundamentally different. And so this is the end of chapter 1 commentary on the book Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. Stay tuned for part 2 because we're going to be going more in depth into the geographic influences and how they have impacted people throughout history. So I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 2.